One of the most transformative developments in early human history occurred with the consolidation of Upper and Lower Egypt, a political integration so enduring that its symbols remained embedded in pharaonic iconography for over 3 millennia. This pivotal moment unfolded around 3100 BCE, during a time when bronze tools were beginning to spread across Mesopotamia and Stonehenge in Britain was first taking shape. In this global context, a revolutionary shift occurred along the Nile. A powerful southern leader, known today as King Narmer, often identified with Mens, achieved what had previously seemed unattainable: the military conquest and political unification of northern Lower Egypt by southern Upper Egypt. In doing so, he laid the foundation for the first centralized territorial state in recorded history, ancient Egypt. The narrative of this monumental achievement is most vividly preserved through an extraordinary artifact, the Narmer palette. Carved from dark green siltstone and discovered at Hierakonpolis, this ceremonial object served a symbolic, not utilitarian, purpose. The dual-faced tablet visually narrates Narmer's triumph and authority. On one side, Narmer is depicted wearing the hedjit, the tall white crown representing Upper Egypt, as he surveys a lineup of decapitated foes, likely symbolizing victory over regional rivals. The reverse side shows him donning the deshret, the red crown of Lower Egypt, while striking down an adversary from the north. These images do more than document a military conquest. They establish a visual doctrine of kingship, uniting narrative art, divine symbolism, and political propaganda for the first time in Egyptian history. What made Narmer's actions truly revolutionary was not merely his ability to defeat his enemies, but how he framed and legitimized his dominion. Rather than treating Lower Egypt as a subjugated region, Narmer crafted a dual kingship, portraying himself as the rightful sovereign of both regions. This strategic framing of authority was pivotal in shaping Egyptian political ideology. This duality gave rise to a new religious and political model. The king was no longer just a temporal ruler, but also a divine intermediary between gods and humans. This fusion of sacred and administrative power would eventually crystallize into the pharaonic institution, shaping Egyptian governance for centuries. Situated near the geographic midpoint of the Nile Valley, Memphis emerged as the capital of the newly unified kingdom. Archaeological evidence suggests that Narmer may have founded the initial settlement, known as Enebhej, or White Walls. Later rulers expanded it into a thriving political, religious, and commercial hub, serving as Egypt's capital for roughly 800 years. The unification of Egypt introduced powerful visual metaphors into royal attire and state symbolism. The most iconic was the skent, or double crown, a combination of the white and red crowns representing Upper and Lower Egypt, respectively. This symbolic fusion emphasized harmony between the once divided lands. Royal titles and heraldry followed suit. Pharaohs began incorporating dualistic emblems into their names. The sedge plant symbolized Upper Egypt, while the bee represented Lower Egypt. Together, they appeared in titles and seals as a permanent reminder of the dual heritage of the Egyptian state. Interestingly, the term pharaoh, though commonly used today to describe ancient Egyptian rulers, wasn't in regular use during Narmer's reign. At that time, monarchs were referred to by titles such as he of the two ladies Nedi and dual king Nesubidi, highlighting their role as sovereigns over the two lands. The word pharaoh itself derives from the Egyptian term paraye, meaning great house, initially a reference to the royal palace, not the monarch. This political fusion spurred a host of institutional advancements essential for administering a unified nation. With authority now centralized, Egypt saw the rapid evolution of hieroglyphic writing, with some of the earliest known inscriptions dating to this period. Writing became crucial for recording laws, rituals, and tax records across distant provinces. In parallel, Egypt developed standardized measurement systems, state-run taxation, and coordinated religious observances. all tailored to manage a vast and diverse population. Regional distinctions in pottery, art, and architecture began to blend into a standardized national style, further solidifying a shared Egyptian identity. Unlike many ancient empires that splintered soon after their founder's death, the political structure Narmer built endured remarkably. His successors expanded upon his foundation, preserving a centralized administration, a common religious ideology, and a unified cultural identity for over 3,000 years, even during eras of fragmentation and foreign occupation. Narmer's unification of Egypt stands as a rare and enduring example of successful nation building in antiquity. His vision not only transformed the Nile Valley into a single political entity, but also gave rise to one of history's most iconic and influential civilizations. The narrative of how ancient Egypt evolved into one of the most iconic civilizations in world history takes a remarkable turn with the Third Dynasty. Around 2686 BCE, a pivotal transformation unfolded as King Djoser ascended the throne. Egypt, still relatively modest in its early dynastic form, was poised for a dramatic and enduring metamorphosis. What had been a developing kingdom would soon become a civilization capable of building wonders that would leave an indelible mark on human history. This new chapter was inaugurated by a royal ambition that would redefine the limits of architecture and kingship. Djoser's vision, combined with the brilliance of his chief advisor Imhotep, set the stage for innovations that would echo for thousands of years. Defying the standard practice of constructing tombs from sun-dried bricks known as mastabas, Djoser commissioned Imhotep, his vizier, high priest, and polymath, to create a tomb that would transcend time. Imhotep conceived a groundbreaking structure, the Step Pyramid Complex at Saqqara. This masterpiece became the first monumental stone edifice in human history, rising approximately 204 feet 62 meters into the sky across 6 massive steps. It was constructed with an estimated 850,000 tons of fine limestone, marking a radical shift from impermanent materials to enduring stonework. The scale and permanence of the step pyramid delivered a bold message. The king's authority was no longer temporary or earthbound, it was eternal. As sunlight reflected off the polished limestone cladding, the pyramid would have glowed brilliantly on the desert horizon, a celestial beacon that proclaimed the divine nature of kingship. It was a symbol of immortality, designed to project the pharaoh's divine essence into the cosmos and eternity. The grandeur of the step pyramid extended beyond the tomb itself. Imhotep designed an entire sacred precinct, enclosed within a vast limestone wall measuring approximately 1,640 feet 500 meters in length and 900 feet 275 meters wide. Within this massive enclosure lay ceremonial courtyards, chapels, and shrines. One of the most important of these spaces was the Heb-Sed festival court, where the king was ritually renewed through ceremonial races and rites, affirming his strength and divine favor to rule. What made Imhotep's architectural work truly revolutionary was his ability to translate structures once made from reeds and wood, temporary materials, into permanent stone forms. This demonstrated that stone could be as versatile and expressive as perishable materials, paving the way for the vast temples and monuments that would later define Egyptian architecture. Imhotep's genius extended far beyond the realm of design. As chief minister, high priest of Ptah, the creator god of Memphis, and royal advisor, he was a true Renaissance figure of the ancient world. He mastered fields ranging from medicine and astronomy to engineering and theology. In medical papyri dated to later periods, Imhotep is credited with performing surgeries and diagnosing illnesses, earning a reputation as a healer and sage. Such was his lasting impact that Imhotep achieved something rare in Egyptian history: deification without royal blood. During the late period, Egyptians began worshiping him as a god of medicine and wisdom, and pilgrims sought his sanctuaries in hopes of divine healing. Temples dedicated to Imhotep existed as far afield as Philae and Deir el-Bahari, where his cult flourished well into the Greco-Roman era. During the Old Kingdom, the notion of divine kingship evolved into a fully integrated religious system. While earlier rulers had associated themselves with deities, Old Kingdom pharaohs were now seen as the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god. In death, they transformed into Osiris, lord of the underworld, thus ensuring the continued harmony of the cosmos. This shift reinforced the idea that the king wasn't just a political figure. He was the intermediary between the mortal world and the gods, a sacred agent who upheld the balance of the universe. At the core of this order lay the concept of Maat, a principle depicted as either a feather or a goddess wearing one. More than simply truth or justice, Maat represented the universal order, balance, and harmony. When a pharaoh declared his allegiance to Maat, he was declaring his role as the guardian of cosmic stability. His duties, such as temple construction, legal fairness, and defense of Egypt's borders, weren't just civic, they were sacred obligations vital to keeping the world from descending into chaos. To fulfill this sacred mandate, the Old Kingdom saw the development of what is widely regarded as the world's first true bureaucratic state. An organized and hierarchical administrative system emerged, designed to oversee every facet of the kingdom. At the top stood the viziers, powerful ministers like Imhotep, followed by layers of officials, scribes, tax assessors, and regional overseers. Titles such as Overseer of all royal works and Keeper of the House of Archives reveal the complexity and specialization of this new state machinery. Thousands of workers across the Nile Valley were employed to manage tax collection, resource allocation, architectural projects, and religious ceremonies. Public inscriptions from this era, often carved into tomb walls and monuments, proudly listed these roles, evidence of a deeply structured government that enabled Egypt to administer a sprawling, increasingly sophisticated civilization. Though the grandeur of pyramids gradually diminished in size, Egypt was undergoing a far deeper transformation, one that reshaped the very foundations of its political and religious identity. As stone monuments grew smaller, the ideology surrounding kingship surged in importance. The pharaoh was no longer merely a monarch ruling over subjects. He became the earthly vessel of divine authority, a sacred intermediary between the mortal world and the gods. This ideological evolution was not by happenstance. It was the result of deliberate theological development. The pharaoh now sat atop an intricately structured cosmological framework, portrayed as the preserver of balance in the universe. His role extended beyond governance. He became the agent who ensured that the cosmos functioned in harmony. Each morning, it was believed that the rising sun owed its ascent to the king's spiritual influence. As the physical embodiment of the divine on earth, the pharaoh conducted sacred rituals that were essential to maintaining Maat, the eternal order of the universe. When he participated in temple rites, he wasn't merely leading devotions. He was renewing the mechanisms of creation itself. As the ideology of divine rule intensified, so too did the visual complexity of royal symbolism. Pharaohs were almost never seen without their sacred regalia. The crook, curved like a shepherd's staff, signified their protective role over the people. The flail, often crossed over the chest with the crook, conveyed their authority to punish and discipline. Their striped Nemes headdress framed the king's face with bold lines, reinforcing his celestial identity. These were not ornamental accessories. They were icons of divine legitimacy, transforming the king into a living deity in the eyes of his people. On temple walls from the Delta to Nubia, a recurring artistic motif emerged with striking regularity, the king striking down enemies with force. Interestingly, many of these smiting scenes were produced during times of peace, not war. These depictions weren't historical records of specific battles, they were protective spells carved in stone. They symbolized the king's eternal triumph over chaos and disorder, functioning as magical wards that safeguarded cosmic stability. Often, the figures being subdued were not real foreign foes, but archetypal representations of chaos, foreignness, and moral disruption. The king's constant victory in these scenes reaffirmed his duty to uphold the divine order of the cosmos. The growing theological stature of the pharaoh necessitated a parallel growth in state organization. The position of vizier, the highest ranking official below the king, was elevated into a vital role within the state's hierarchy. Frequently drawn from the noble elite or even the royal family, viziers became the central pillars of governance. Daily, the vizier met with the king to receive instructions, oversee statecraft, and then administer those policies throughout the vast network of Egyptian administration. His responsibilities spanned judicial oversight, taxation, infrastructure, and provincial management. In the absence of the king, the vizier wielded near total authority, though always beneath the sacred mantle of royal power. As religious devotion expanded, so too did the material reach of Egypt's temples. These vast temple complexes, such as Karnak and Luxor, were more than centers of worship. They were economic institutions with tremendous influence. They controlled extensive farmlands, employed skilled artisans, and managed large labor forces. Temples functioned like state-run enterprises, producing goods, managing trade, and redistributing resources. By the zenith of the New Kingdom, temple estates were believed to possess control over roughly one-third of Egypt's fertile land. Every donation a pharaoh made, be it livestock, fields, or gold, was not merely an offering to the gods, but a strategic reinforcement of the intertwining power of priesthood and kingship. Through these gifts, temples became both spiritual and economic bastions, strengthening the ideological and fiscal foundations of royal rule. The religious doctrines justifying pharaonic authority also underwent significant refinement. Chief among these was the ascension of the solar cult of Ra. Worship of the sun god gained enormous prominence, and kings increasingly adopted the epithet Son of Ra as part of their official titles. In the context of Egyptian belief, this was not figurative, it was taken quite literally. It was taught that the divine essence of Ra directly infused the queen during conception, thereby creating a king who was the literal offspring of the sun deity. This theology bestowed upon each ruler a sacred lineage that connected Egypt to the heavens. With this divine heritage, every pharaoh was viewed not just as a human leader, but as a physical embodiment of divine will, a living channel between the people of Egypt and the gods of the celestial realm. As centralized rule disintegrated, two determined cities emerged to vie for dominance over Egypt's destiny. In the north stood Heracleopolis, and in the south, Thebes, each separated not just by miles, but by contrasting visions of Egypt's future after the collapse of divine monarchy. Spanning roughly from 2160 to 2055 BC, this disjointed epoch, known as the First Intermediate Period, brought with it not just instability, but an unexpected wave of cultural ingenuity. In the absence of a singular authority, regional centers thrived, experimenting with ideas and art forms beyond the reach of Old Kingdom orthodoxy. With the old system of state-sponsored artisans diminished, local craftsmen seized creative freedom. Workshops across the land, no longer bound by strict royal design mandates, began producing distinct and imaginative works. Burial chambers at sites like Moala and Kokeba featured innovative visual storytelling and artistic motifs, designs that would never have been approved under the rigid Old Kingdom aesthetic. The Northern Realm was born under Khedi I, who established Egypt's 9th dynasty around 2160 BCE. Controlling the agriculturally rich Nile Delta and parts of Middle Egypt, Heracleopolitan rulers had strategic access to Mediterranean trade and inland waterways. These kings built legitimacy not on God-given rights, but through public service, protecting transport routes and combating lawlessness during a time marred by famine and unrest. Meanwhile, in Upper Egypt, the city of Waset, later known as Thebes, rose under regional leaders who would declare sovereignty as the 11th dynasty, These Theban kings, starting with figures like Intef I and Intef II, leveraged their proximity to Nubian gold and desert trade arteries to fuel territorial ambitions. Their forces advanced northward, directly contesting Heracleopolitan influence and laying the groundwork for eventual reunification. In this turbulent landscape, authority had to be earned. Leaders could no longer rely on divine lineage alone. Biographies etched into tombs reflect this shift. "I gave bread to the starving and clothed the naked," proclaims one governor's inscription. Such declarations marked a departure from theological entitlement toward a social contract rooted in stewardship and personal merit. This era also gave rise to Egypt's earliest known political discourse. Texts like the Instruction for King Narmer, authored by a Heracleopolitan monarch for his heir, delivered pragmatic leadership advice. "Master the art of speech, for it is mightier than the sword." Unlike earlier works that glorified kingship, these writings acknowledge the complexities of governance during uncertain times. One of the most profound literary reflections from this period is the Admonitions of Ipuwer, a poetic lamentation that inverts Egypt's social order. The pauper is jubilant, the noble mourns. The one who built nothing now owns cattle. Scholars interpret this either as a direct response to societal collapse or a philosophical critique of upheaval and lost hierarchies. Archaeological findings reveal that in the absence of centralized rule, provincial nobility flourished. Rock-cut tombs in Ascent and Beni Hazen are elaborately adorned with scenes of leisure and prosperity, hunting, fishing, and bountiful harvests, some rivaling the grandeur of royal burials. These lavish displays of status, once suppressed under a centralized monarchy, now expressed a newfound elite autonomy. This fragmentation also allowed unprecedented upward mobility. Tomb inscriptions from individuals of humble origins highlight a meritocratic shift. People rose to positions of influence not by noble birth, but through capability and loyalty. The dismantling of the old kingdom's rigid hierarchy created space for competence to triumph over heritage. After nearly a century of division, a powerful Theban king emerged to restore unity. Mentuhotep II launched a series of calculated military campaigns and diplomatic unions beginning around 2055 BCE. His strategic efforts culminated in the reconsolidation of Egypt, ending the First Intermediate Period and inaugurating the Middle Kingdom. To immortalize his triumph, he commissioned a groundbreaking mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. This structure, blending classical pyramid features with novel architectural elements, reflected not only his victory, but Egypt's cultural evolution during a century of upheaval. From the disarray of the First Intermediate Period rose not a simple return to past traditions, but a bold reinvention of Egypt's political and cultural fabric. While Mentuhotep II is often hailed as Egypt's second great unifier, his true legacy lies in how his reunification efforts redefined the bond between sovereign and subject, setting a new precedent that would shape Egyptian governance for over a millennium. Following his successful consolidation of power, Mentuhotep II faced the daunting task of repairing a fractured nation. Reunification brought not just geographical unity, but a need for ideological harmony. In contrast to the Old Kingdom rulers who had governed from the established capital of Memphis, the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom chose Thebes as their seat of authority, a powerful symbol of shifting political dynamics and regional influence. But this relocation was more than logistical. It marked a complete transformation in Egypt's national identity, integrating new religious and administrative values with long-standing traditions. The ascendancy of Thebes ushered in sweeping religious changes. Amun, once a relatively obscure local deity, began a meteoric rise to supremacy, eventually merging with the sun god Ra to form Amun-Ra, the new state deity. This fusion of theology created both religious continuity and innovation, aligning Theban ideology with national reverence. Mentuhotep II's throne name, Nebuchadnezzar, translated as "the Lord of the Rudder is Ra," reflected this new theological blend. It asserted both his divine endorsement and his connection to Theban religious roots, effectively anchoring the king in solar cosmology while expanding his divine authority. The Middle Kingdom introduced an evolved understanding of pharaonic responsibility. In contrast to the remote, divine monarchs of earlier times, these kings were portrayed as accessible rulers with an obligation to justice and fairness. Royal inscriptions and popular literature reflected this ideological shift. One of the clearest examples is the tale of the eloquent peasant, a story in which a humble farmer appeals repeatedly to officials for justice. The narrative champions the idea that moral governance and the rule of law are foundational to divine order. In royal texts, rulers were encouraged to speak mot, do mot, a reminder that justice was not merely imposed from above, but embodied in everyday decisions. The architecture of the period mirrored these political and cultural shifts. Mentuhotep II's mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari marked a break from traditional designs. Built against a dramatic cliffside, the structure blended traditional pyramid symbolism with open colonnaded terraces, a unique hybrid of Upper and Lower Egyptian styles that visually reinforced national unity. This design approach would go on to inspire later monumental projects, including the temples of Hatshepsut and other new kingdom builders. The restructured government of the Middle Kingdom emphasized effective provincial management. New administrative roles were created, including the vital office of the Overseer of Sealed Things, a position responsible for overseeing storage and trade. This title indicates the growing importance of logistics and inventory control in Egypt's expanding economic landscape. Extant papyri from this era detail meticulous record-keeping, from grain yields and livestock counts to expedition personnel, showcasing a highly organized and data-driven administration. Economic revival went hand in hand with territorial ambitions. Middle Kingdom rulers launched military expeditions to the south, building fortified outposts at key locations like Buin and Semna to secure Nubian trade routes and mineral resources. These fortresses weren't purely defensive. They served as economic hubs, regulating commerce from Inner Africa and asserting Egyptian influence deep into Nubia. The pharaohs also reactivated mining operations in the Sinai Peninsula, extracting turquoise and copper. Long-distance trade routes were reestablished, leading to expeditions to the fabled land of Punt, believed by many scholars to be in present-day Somalia, bringing back exotic animals, fragrant myrrh trees, ebony, and ivory. Military practices also evolved during this period. Innovations included the introduction of the composite bow, offering superior range and force, along with advanced protective gear, and the koppish, a curved sword that became iconic in Egyptian warfare. Surviving military manuals and instructional texts provide insight into battlefield strategies and formations, revealing the rise of a more disciplined, professional fighting force compared to earlier periods. The Middle Kingdom was also a golden age for Egyptian literature and philosophy. Profound works like the Instructions of Amenemhat advised rulers on wisdom and leadership, while the shipwrecked sailor wove imaginative tales of resilience and divine encounters. Meanwhile, the dialogue of a man with his ba delved into existential questions about death, identity, and the afterlife, offering a deeply introspective look at the Egyptian soul. Art mirrored these intellectual currents. Middle Kingdom sculptors moved away from the flawless idealism of earlier eras, embracing realism. Statues from this period often display thoughtful expressions, lined features, and signs of age, conveying the burdens of leadership and the humanity of the pharaoh. Even royal statues showed this vulnerability, portraying kings not as eternal gods, but as wise and weathered leaders, a radical departure that underscored the evolving perception of power. Despite its majestic temples and administrative achievements, the Middle Kingdom was built on foundations far more delicate than its enduring monuments implied. The very structures that propelled Egypt to new heights concealed weaknesses that, once exposed, plunged the land into one of the most disordered periods in its history, an era so disruptive that later scribes nearly omitted it from official chronicles. The decline began as the 13th dynasty took the reins. Unlike the smooth dynastic transitions of the preceding 12th dynasty, these later kings frequently ruled for short, unstable tenures, sometimes lasting only weeks or months before being replaced. This rapid succession of monarchs shattered the administrative continuity that had underpinned the Middle Kingdom's golden age. Each new ruler brought fresh policies, new officials, and unpredictable changes that weakened the government's core. As royal power waned, Egypt's frontiers, especially in the eastern delta, became increasingly susceptible to infiltration. This region, historically the most exposed part of Egypt, began to absorb a steady stream of migrants from the Levant, particularly from the land of Canaan. These arrivals weren't invaders, but families and merchants looking to share in Egypt's remaining prosperity. They established communities in thriving northern cities such as Avaris, integrating into Egyptian life while still retaining ties to their homelands. Over time, this subtle migration became a decisive force. Around 1650 BCE, a group of these settlers, referred to in Egyptian records as the Hyksos Heka Kasut, or rulers of foreign lands, seized control over the delta. Under the leadership of Seleucus, they declared the formation of Egypt's 15th dynasty, securing the agriculturally rich north and relegating the native Egyptian authorities to marginal southern territories. What distinguishes the Hyksos takeover is not just its occurrence, but its nature. Unlike the more violent conquests of later empires such as the Assyrians or Persians, the Hyksos integration was more akin to a strategic power shift than a full-blown invasion. Excavations at Avaris, the Hyksos capital, reveal a city that blended Levantine urban planning and burial customs with unmistakably Egyptian features. Archaeological finds, including scarabs and official seals, display the names of Hyksos kings written with full Egyptian titulary, complete with royal cartouches and pharaonic imagery, yet preserving their non-Egyptian names and identities. This dual identity showcases how the Hyksos adopted the mantle of Egyptian kingship while maintaining cultural uniqueness. Perhaps the most profound impact of the Hyksos occupation was their military innovation. Hailing from the volatile borderlands between Egypt and Mesopotamia, they introduced revolutionary technologies to Egyptian warfare. Chief among these was the horse-drawn chariot, equipped with lightweight composite wheels that prioritized speed and maneuverability. These fast-moving platforms enabled archers to strike swiftly and withdraw before enemy infantry could react, giving the Hyksos a strategic edge Egypt had never faced before. In addition, the Hyksos brought with them advanced bronze weaponry forged with improved metallurgical techniques. Their blades and axes were stronger, sharper, and more durable than traditional Egyptian arms, permanently altering the region's military landscape. While the Hyksos ruled the north, native Egyptian dynasties managed to maintain control over the southern region, particularly from the city of Thebes. These southern kings, known collectively as the 17th dynasty, began to absorb the very military technologies introduced by their northern adversaries. Tomb art and grave goods from this period reveal a fascinating duality. Rulers who upheld traditional Egyptian values yet were increasingly equipped with foreign-style weapons and adopting military imagery once associated with the Hyksos. They also began crafting a nationalist narrative of defiance, portraying themselves as defenders of the Egyptian soul against foreign rule. One of the major challenges historians face in reconstructing this turbulent era is the absence of official documentation. Unlike the Middle Kingdom, where administrative records were abundant and meticulously maintained, this period offers only scattered fragments, mainly in the form of private inscriptions, archaeological ruins, and later historical commentaries. Many of these sources were written long after the events occurred and are often shaped by propaganda and patriotic fervor. As a result, even the order and identities of the Hyksos and native kings remain subjects of scholarly debate. with multiple competing king lists and chronologies. Despite the portrayal of the Hyksos as mere usurpers in later Egyptian history, the truth is far more complex. Cultural exchange flowed both ways. The Hyksos adopted many aspects of Egyptian governance, from administrative structures to temple construction. They embraced Egyptian deities, especially Set, the god of chaos and storms, who they associated with their own weather gods. Religious texts from this time period show experimental theological ideas that blended Egyptian and Near Eastern beliefs, many of which would influence the development of later Egyptian religious traditions. After nearly a century of divided rule, tensions between the Thebans in the south and the Hyksos in the north erupted into war. One of the earliest martyrs of this resistance was Seqenenre-Dao, a Theban king whose mummified body was discovered with multiple head wounds, injuries consistent with Hyksos-style battle axes. His brutal death points to his likely demise on the battlefield during the opening stages of rebellion. His son, Kamose, carried the fight forward, leading successful campaigns and leaving behind a victory stele inscribed with impassioned words. In it, he questions how Egypt had come to be divided. Why should I tolerate a ruler in Avars and another in Kush, while I share power with an Asiatic and a Nubian, each holding a piece of my homeland? These words capture the spirit of a nation on the brink of reunification. The struggle would eventually be completed by Ahmose-I, who expelled the Hyksos and founded the New Kingdom, a new era of power and empire that began not quietly, but in the crucible of war. Egypt's transformation didn't begin in quiet diplomacy, but in a sweeping triumph that would reshape its fate for generations. After enduring nearly a century of subjugation under foreign Hyksos rule, Ahmose-I, a determined prince of Thebes, launched an unyielding military campaign to restore Egypt's independence and pride. Building upon the sacrifice of his father, Seqenenre-Dao, and his brother, Kamose, both of whom had perished in battle against the Hyksos invaders, Ahmose finally expelled the foreign rulers around 1550 BCE. With this decisive victory, he not only reclaimed the fragmented land, but also inaugurated a new era, the birth of the 18th dynasty, and with it, the New Kingdom. Ahmose's conquest meant far more than the removal of foreign rulers. It catalyzed a profound transformation in Egypt's national identity and global outlook. The painful memory of occupation by outsiders etched itself into the Egyptian psyche, sparking an enduring resolve. Never again would Egypt allow itself to be vulnerable to external domination. What had once been a kingdom focused inward, content in its geographical insulation, now turned its gaze beyond its borders. The strategy of defensive self-containment gave way to aggressive expansionism, designed to build buffer zones and enforce Egypt's influence far into neighboring territories like Nubia and the Levant. The astonishing success of Egypt's expansion was rooted in a complete military overhaul. Ironically, many of Egypt's new strategies were borrowed and improved from the very Hyksos they had ousted. The chariot, once a foreign innovation, became the crown jewel of Egyptian warfare, fast, maneuverable, and perfect for mounted archers to unleash volleys before rapidly retreating. These changes weren't just tactical. The army itself was transformed into a professional standing force rather than a temporary levy raised for emergencies. Service in the military became one of the fastest routes to wealth and status. Successful officers were granted vast estates, titles, and influence at court, making the military an integral pillar of Egypt's ruling structure. Throughout this imperial resurgence, Thebes remained the beating heart of Egypt, both spiritually and administratively. Monumental construction projects filled its skyline, glorifying the newly victorious dynasty. But behind the marble and ceremony, a new center of power was rising, the priesthood of Amun. The priests of Amun had supported the Theban royal family during their resistance against the Hyksos, and now they were handsomely rewarded. Ahmose-I and his successors bestowed vast tracts of land and unimaginable wealth upon Amun's temples. Amun's status, once that of a regional god, was elevated to that of a national deity. When merged with the sun god Ra, he became Amun-Ra, the supreme divine force in the Egyptian pantheon. The high priests of Amun didn't just hold spiritual authority, they commanded enormous political and economic power, rivaling that of the pharaohs themselves. Egypt's imperial machine was powered by a robust economic foundation. The gold mines of Nubia, long a source of wealth, now flowed steadily with tribute. Conquered territories sent regular payments, and ancient trade routes, once disrupted by war, were reopened and expanded. Amo spearheaded the rebuilding of damaged infrastructure and initiated bold new construction campaigns. Quarries were reopened, new trade missions were dispatched, and luxury goods, timber from Lebanon, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, incense from Punt, began pouring into Egypt in record amounts. This economic surge allowed for architectural achievements on an unprecedented scale, transforming the Egyptian landscape with temples, obelisks, and palaces. But conquest alone didn't secure Egypt's new role as a dominant power. A sophisticated diplomatic system was developed to maintain stability. Marriages were arranged between Egyptian royals and foreign princesses, sealing alliances with neighboring powers. Treaties were carefully negotiated, and loyal administrators were appointed in vassal territories to ensure order. One particularly effective method of soft control was the education of foreign elites in Egypt. Children of foreign rulers were brought to the Egyptian court, not as prisoners, but as honored guests. They were immersed in Egyptian language, customs, and ideology, becoming cultural bridges and ensuring their families' continued loyalty to the pharaoh. The royal court during this time reflected Egypt's new global stature. Far from rejecting outside influence, Egypt now embraced it on its own terms. Foreign styles in art, fashion, jewelry, and language became fashionable. Nobles adorned themselves with imported silks and war styles inspired by their Eastern neighbors. Yet even in this cosmopolitan environment, Egyptian religious practices and royal symbolism remained sacred and untouched. The blend of foreign and native elements created a vibrant court culture that celebrated Egypt's supremacy while incorporating the diversity of its empire. This period of cultural blossoming would reach its zenith in the reigns of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, during which Egyptian architecture, sculpture, and artistic expression soared to new heights. Their monuments would stand as eternal testaments to an empire reborn through struggle, sharpened by war, and polished through cultural fusion. By adapting and refining military and administrative practices introduced by foreign rulers, Egypt launched itself into a new era of unprecedented dominance. What initially began as a defensive policy to guard against invasions swiftly evolved into a massive, well-oiled imperial structure. During its peak, Egypt's empire extended over 2,000 miles from the delta in the north to the depths of Nubia in the south, drawing a continuous stream of wealth and resources into the coffers of the pharaoh. The visionary monarchs of the 18th dynasty harnessed this flow of tribute to transform Egypt into a dominant imperial force. Territories that were once enemies became tributary states, providing gold, cattle, slaves, exotic items, and military support, all strengthening the throne in Thebes. Among Egypt's early empire builders, Thutmose I pushed Egyptian influence to heights never before achieved. He spearheaded bold military expeditions into Syria, and in a landmark campaign, extended Egypt's reach to the Euphrates River, a boundary commemorated with a monumental victory steely proclaiming the extent of Egyptian power to all rivals in the region. But it was his grandson, Thutmose III, who would etch his name as Egypt's most formidable military commander. Ascending the throne after the passing of Hatshepsut, he conducted a staggering 17 military campaigns over 2 decades, consolidating Egyptian control from Nubia in the south to Mesopotamia in the northeast. One of his most celebrated triumphs came at the historic Battle of Megiddo. Faced with a powerful alliance of rebellious Canaanite rulers, Thutmose's generals advised caution, suggesting a longer, safer route around the fortified city. But the young pharaoh famously refused, stating, "I shall proceed on the road to Megiddo. If you truly stand by me, follow my lead." He led his forces through a perilous mountain pass, catching the enemy completely unprepared. The Egyptian troops overwhelmed their opponents, scattering the coalition and initiating a 7-month siege. The city's eventual fall resulted in the surrender of multiple city-states and a permanent Egyptian presence in the Levant. The Egyptian military system, refined under these warrior kings, became more advanced than ever. In addition to elite chariot corps, the army featured highly specialized divisions of archers, infantry, and reconnaissance units. Amenhotep II, the son of Thutmose III, glorified his own combat prowess by claiming he could fire arrows through metal targets while racing his chariot at full speed, a claim that, whether literal or symbolic, helped sustain the divine image of the pharaoh as an invincible warrior king. Behind these military victories stood an exceptional imperial bureaucracy that enabled long-term control with minimal forces. Egyptian garrisons were strategically positioned across conquered lands, each staffed with military commanders, revenue officers, and diplomatic envoys who ensured compliance and gathered intelligence. Local monarchs who accepted Egyptian rule were allowed to remain in power on one condition: their heirs had to be sent to Egypt for education. This strategy, thinly veiled as an honor, functioned as a political safeguard, ensuring loyalty by turning future leaders into Egyptian-educated allies. Egypt's triumphs were not only lived, they were immortalized. On the walls of the Karnak temple, Thutmose III had carved the famous Annals, a detailed chronicle of his campaigns. These inscriptions recorded with astonishing precision the spoils of war: 924 chariots, 2,041 horses, 2,503 captured nobles, huge volumes of gold, silver, and luxury goods. These records weren't simply historical logs, they were instruments of propaganda, reinforcing the pharaoh's divine right to maintain cosmic order through military might. Egypt's expansion didn't just enrich its treasury, it redefined its culture. Luxury items from foreign lands became symbols of status among Egypt's aristocracy. Minoan-style frescoes adorned palace walls, Levantine jewelry glittered in elite tombs, and foreign delicacies filled banquet halls. Even religion wasn't untouched. Deities like Baal and Astarte, once foreign gods, were slowly woven into the Egyptian pantheon, reflecting the cultural fusion of empire. The Egyptian language itself evolved, absorbing hundreds of loanwords, especially in the realms of warfare, diplomacy, and trade. As Egypt's international profile rose, a new class of diplomatic officials emerged. These were skilled, multilingual emissaries capable of navigating the intricacies of imperial politics. They delivered royal decrees, negotiated treaties, and conducted espionage disguised as commerce. This global web of alliances and rivalries is revealed in the famous Amarna letters, clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the era. These documents reveal correspondence between Egypt and the great powers of the ancient world, including the Mitanni, Hittites, Assyrians, and Babylonians. Following the spiritual revival initiated under Tutankhamun, Egypt faced a different challenge, one that could not be resolved through ritual alone. The nation craved not only the comfort of tradition, but the presence of a leader whose legacy would be etched not just in hieroglyphs, but in the very soul of human history. Though many pharaohs were venerated as gods, only one ruler would so profoundly merge divinity with mortal kingship that over 3 millennia later, we still speak his name with awe: Ramses the Great. Born around 1303 BC into the powerful 19th dynasty, Ramses II took the throne in his early 20s, succeeding his father, Seti I, whose reign was short but impactful. What followed was an astonishing 66-year reign, one of the longest in Egyptian history, marked by political dominance, artistic grandeur, and monumental legacy building. By the time of his passing at an extraordinary 90 years of age, Ramses had fathered more than 100 children through numerous consorts and queens. In essence, he created a dynastic lineage within a dynasty, shaping the royal bloodline for generations to come. While earlier pharaohs erected impressive buildings, Ramses undertook construction projects on a scale so vast that it bordered on the obsessive. Nowhere is this more evident than at Abu Simbel, a breathtaking temple complex carved into solid rock on the banks of the Nile in Nubia. The great temple at Abu Simbel is guarded by four immense statues of Ramses seated on his throne, each towering at 66 feet. What sets this marvel apart isn't just its size, it's the precision of its alignment. Twice each year, on February 22nd and October 22nd, the morning sun penetrates the temple's inner sanctum, illuminating the statues of Ramses, Amun-Ra, and Ra-Horikti, while deliberately leaving the figure of Ptah, god of the underworld, in eternal shadow. Beyond Abu Simbel, Ramses initiated or expanded over a dozen grand temples, installed countless statues, and even founded entire cities. His mortuary complex, known as the Ramesseum, featured a seated colossus estimated to weigh more than 1,000 tons, a staggering feat that would challenge even today's engineering capabilities. In Karnak and Luxor, enormous halls filled with pillars, obelisks, and shrines bore his name. His new capital city, Pyrameses, located in the Nile Delta, became a sprawling metropolis described in ancient texts as glittering like the horizon of heaven. It served not just as a royal residence, but as a vital administrative and military center, complete with stables, weapons factories, and barracks. Though he is often remembered as a supreme builder, Ramses II first made his mark as a military commander. In the 5th year of his rule, he launched a daring expedition against the rising threat of the Hittite Empire. The climactic confrontation occurred near the fortress city of Kadesh, in what is now modern Syria. Ramses, having advanced too far ahead of his reinforcements, found himself nearly overwhelmed by enemy forces. Yet, according to royal inscriptions, he single-handedly repelled thousands of attackers in a superhuman feat of courage until his army arrived. Though most modern scholars consider the battle a tactical draw, Ramses transformed it into a legendary victory through elaborate depictions on temple walls. These reliefs showed him charging alone into enemy ranks, scenes meant to reinforce his divine valor and invincibility. The outcome of Kadesh ultimately led to something far more historic than a military win: the world's earliest surviving international peace treaty. In 1258 BCE, Egypt and the Hittite Empire formalized their truce through a bilateral agreement carved in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform. This treaty, outlining territorial borders, military cooperation, and even extradition protocols, was unprecedented. So profound was its legacy that a replica of the treaty now resides at the United Nations headquarters in New York, a testament to Ramses' role as both warrior and peacemaker. Among Ramses' many wives, Queen Nefertari held a uniquely cherished place in his heart. During her lifetime, she was accorded honors few women ever received. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is regarded as one of the most exquisite in all of Egypt, with its walls adorned in vivid frescoes that retain their color even after 3,000 years. To commemorate her memory and divine status, Ramses commissioned a smaller temple at Abu Simbel, dedicated both to Nefertari and to the goddess Hathor, a rare tribute that elevated her to near-divine status alongside the gods. One of the most intriguing aspects of Ramses' reign was his practice of claiming older monuments. He frequently inscribed his cartouche, his royal name, over earlier inscriptions left by previous rulers. This was no mere display of arrogance. It was a calculated act of historical revisionism. By rebranding the accomplishments of prior kings as his own, Ramses ensured that future generations would see him as the central figure in Egypt's narrative. This policy of historical reinscription solidified his legacy, making it nearly impossible to distinguish where the truth ended and the legend began. Amid the disorder and division that fractured Egypt during one of its most unstable eras, a formidable power was quietly rising far to the south. Beyond the first cataract of the Nile, past even the second, an ancient African kingdom was preparing to forever alter the destiny of the Egyptian state. This kingdom was Kush, and its rulers were not content to merely survive. They intended to redefine empire. By approximately 745 BCE, while Egypt's fractured local dynasties vied for dominance, the Kushites surged northward, not as marauders, but as guardians of a civilization they admired and saw as sacred. Their approach was not that of plunderers, but of redeemers. The Kushite leader known as Pi, also recorded as Pianki, was the founder of Egypt's 25th dynasty and the architect of this southern revival. He led his forces across the Nile frontier with a conviction that went beyond political ambition. His motives were deeply spiritual. An inscribed monument, the Victory Stela of Pi, uncovered at Napata, provides crucial insight into his intentions. In it, Pi condemns the Egyptian nobles not for military resistance, but for religious negligence. He was appalled by their failure to perform proper purification rites and their disregard for temple sanctity. "How dare you stand in the house of Horus with bodies defiled?" Pi is recorded as saying to the vanquished lords. Far from being a typical conqueror, Pi insisted on ritual purity during every step of his campaign. Before entering Memphis, the spiritual heart of Egypt, he washed in sacred waters and made formal offerings to the gods. His mission was not to dominate Egypt, but to cleanse and protect it. Long before their conquest, the Kushites had been absorbing Egyptian culture for centuries. They wrote in hieroglyphics, erected pyramids, steep-sided and smaller, yet unmistakably Egyptian, and venerated Egyptian gods as their own. Royal necropolises at El Kuru and Nuri reveal burial customs that blended Egyptian mortuary rites with distinct Nubian identity. They were not cultural outsiders. When they entered Egypt, they didn't need to learn its traditions. They were already practitioners of its legacy. Pi's successor, his brother or possibly son, Shabaka, further consolidated Kushite rule. He relocated the administrative hub to Thebes, reinforcing the dynasty's sacred authority. Shabaka is most famous for his attempt to rescue Egypt's ancient religious knowledge. He ordered the transcription of decaying papyri onto durable stone. The Shabaka stone, as it is now known, contains what is believed to be a copy of a much older document, a cosmological myth attributed to the Memphite priesthood. Through this act, Shabaka preserved foundational beliefs from Egypt's earliest dynasties. Perhaps the most renowned of the Kushite kings was Taharqa, whose reign marked the peak of Nubian power in the region. Under his leadership, both Egypt and Nubia saw a cultural and political renaissance. He initiated monumental construction projects across the land. At Karnak, he erected a grand colonnade of towering columns crowned with papyrus capitals, reviving the grandeur of New Kingdom architecture. In Kawa, located in Nubia, he commissioned temples that rivaled those in Egypt's heartland. These monuments showcased a distinct artistic style. Royal images depicted muscular physiques, powerful jawlines, and bold features that reflected both Nubian strength and aesthetic. Taharqa's rule brought a revival of religious architecture, art, and ceremony not seen since the age of Ramses the Great. Archaeological evidence confirms that the Kushites restored crumbling temples, repaired statues, and reactivated artistic workshops throughout Egypt. Their construction efforts weren't just about beauty, they were declarations of legitimacy, aimed at proving that the Nubian kings were the rightful guardians of Egyptian tradition. The Nubian dynasty's rule eventually faced its greatest threat from the powerful Assyrian Empire, led by kings Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal. The Assyrians, recognizing Egypt and Kush as a unified force, launched a series of aggressive campaigns. In 671 BC, Esarhaddon invaded and captured Memphis, driving Taharqa southward. Though the Kushites would momentarily regain Lower Egypt, the relentless pressure of the Assyrian war machine proved too great. After repeated defeats, the Kushite rulers withdrew from Egypt and returned to their homeland in Nubia. Though the 25th dynasty's control over Egypt was relatively short-lived, its cultural and spiritual influence was monumental. The Kushite rulers revered Egypt's ancient customs with such devotion that they ended up preserving texts, rituals, and artistic styles that may have otherwise vanished amid the country's internal collapse. In a remarkable twist of history, a people once considered outsiders came to embody the very essence of Egyptian civilization. They saw themselves not as conquerors, but as stewards of a sacred legacy, a unique reversal in which the so-called vanquished became the true keepers of the conquered culture. From the depths of centuries of foreign rule, a resurgent Egypt rose with a renewed determination to restore its soul by paradoxically embracing both forward-looking innovation and a passionate resurgence of its ancient heritage. Amid the weathered remnants of once glorious Thebes, a surprising renewal began to unfold, a cultural revival that honored the pharaonic legacy while adapting to a shifting global stage. At the center of this transformation stood Psamtik, also spelled Psammetichus, a former client king under Assyrian control who would go on to become Egypt's liberator. Around 664 BCE, Psamtik seized control of the Nile Delta, gradually expanding his power southward until the country was once again unified under native rule. Rather than relying solely on military might, Psamtik made a strategic move that cemented his legitimacy. He sent his daughter, Nitocris, to Thebes, where she was ceremonially adopted by the influential divine Atartris of Amun. This political-religious alliance merged the authority of the north with the sacred power of the south. The rulers of the 26th dynasty, named after their capital sites, initiated what modern historians refer to as the Sate Renaissance. This was not merely a return to political order. It was a deliberate cultural resurrection aimed at reviving the grandeur of Egypt's most revered epochs. Court artisans and architects meticulously studied Old Kingdom and New Kingdom tombs and temples, replicating their designs with extraordinary precision. They recreated ancient scenes and rituals in art, not as innovation, but as devotion. Meanwhile, scribes collected and recopied religious manuscripts, preserving archaic hymns, funerary texts, and priestly formulas. New temples were erected with proportions and floor plans drawn straight from the blueprints of dynasties that had reigned 1,000 years prior. This wasn't simple nostalgia, it was a calculated form of political messaging. By aligning themselves with the sacred memory of Egypt's greatest ages, the Sate pharaohs reaffirmed their right to rule in the eyes of a people traumatized by invasions and foreign overlords. Egypt became a nation of temples functioning as living museums, where the past was not remembered but reborn. Ironically, even as Egypt turned inward for identity, it was simultaneously becoming more connected to the outside world than ever before. The Mediterranean, especially Greece, now played a critical role in Egypt's economy and military structure. Under Ramses II, who ruled from around 570 BC, Greek merchants were granted permission to settle at Naucratis, a port city in the western delta. This became the first officially sanctioned Greek trading colony in Egypt, where commodities like olive oil and wine were exchanged for grain, linen, and papyrus. Excavations at Naucratis have uncovered vast quantities of Greek pottery, tools, and inscriptions, sitting alongside distinctly Egyptian items, proof of thriving cultural fusion. The Egyptian army during this time increasingly relied on foreign warriors, particularly the Greeks, whom the Egyptians called bronze men for their armor. These mercenaries were not mere hired swords, they were land-owning settlers who integrated into Egyptian life. Many of them married locally, adopted Egyptian religious customs, and even dedicated stelae and statues in a hybrid Greco-Egyptian artistic style that merged classical symmetry with hieroglyphic symbolism. Despite this cultural and economic revival, Egypt's position on the world stage remained fragile. Following the collapse of Assyrian power, Egypt briefly extended its reach into the Levant. Necho II, Psamtik's son, initiated ambitious projects, most notably a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea, a precursor to the modern Suez Canal. Though incomplete in his lifetime, the idea demonstrated Egypt's desire to remain a central player in global trade. However, a greater threat loomed in the east. The rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great drastically altered the regional balance. Pharaoh Ramses II pursued a skillful policy of foreign diplomacy, forging alliances with Greek city-states and King Croesus of Lydia to counter Persian expansion. His strategy succeeded in keeping Egypt both sovereign and prosperous for a time. But the conflict he had delayed would soon arrive with brutal clarity. In 525 BCE, Cyrus's son Cambyses II led a full-scale invasion into Egypt. At the Battle of Pelusium, the Persian army decisively defeated Psamtik III, the last pharaoh of the Sate line. Ancient Egyptian sources recount a strange and controversial tactic. The Persians allegedly used sacred animals, particularly cats, at the front lines, knowing that Egyptian soldiers, out of religious reverence, would hesitate to shoot. While likely symbolic or exaggerated, this account highlights the deep cultural contrast between Persian militarism and Egyptian spirituality. Following this defeat, Egypt was absorbed into the Achaemenid Empire, and the 27th dynasty began, the first fully foreign dynasty to rule Egypt. Although Persian satraps retained much of the Egyptian bureaucratic system, the psychological blow to Egyptian identity was immense. Revolts continued to erupt over the following century, and fleeting moments of independence occurred under the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties. But each resurgence was weaker than the last. The final flicker of native rule came under Nectanebo II, who tried desperately to defend Egypt's sovereignty against renewed Persian aggression. In 343 BCE, facing overwhelming odds, he fled south to Nubia, leaving Egypt once again under foreign control, this time for good. The struggle of Egypt's late period tells a powerful story, one of resilience through memory, of a civilization seeking to resurrect its soul through cultural revival, even as the world changed irrevocably around it. It was the end of native rule, but not the end of Egypt's legacy, one that would continue to influence empires long after the last pharaoh had vanished from the Nile. The course of Egyptian history shifted dramatically in 525 BC when Cambyses II, king of the Achaemenid Empire, launched a full-scale invasion against Pharaoh Psamtik III. The two forces clashed at the pivotal Battle of Pelusium, a conflict that would mark the fall of Egypt's independence and the dawn of Persian rule. The encounter became legendary not only for its decisive result, but also for Cambyses' alleged use of psychological warfare. Aware of the Egyptians' reverence for cats, believed to embody divine qualities, Persian troops reportedly carried live cats into battle or painted feline images on their shields. Egyptian archers, unwilling to harm these sacred animals, reportedly hesitated to attack, allowing Persian forces to advance with minimal resistance, a clever strategy, though some scholars view the story as more symbolic than literal. Following his victory, Cambyses II did not abolish Egyptian customs outright. Instead, he chose to adopt the titles and regalia of a pharaoh, portraying himself in traditional iconography to legitimize his rule. This dual identity, as both Persian monarch and Egyptian king, marked the beginning of the 27th dynasty, the first foreign dynasty to govern Egypt using Egyptian political and religious conventions. The Achaemenid strategy was not solely military. They recognized that to govern effectively, they needed the support, or at least the compliance, of the Egyptian elite. Egypt was reorganized as a satrapy province within the vast Persian Empire, Administration was carried out by both Persian overseers and native Egyptian officials, resulting in a hybrid bureaucracy. While ultimate control rested with the Persians, the day-to-day management often relied on the expertise of local scribes and priests. Despite their adherence to Zoroastrianism, Persian rulers displayed remarkable sensitivity toward Egyptian religious traditions. They participated in ceremonies, made temple offerings, and even commissioned inscriptions showing them performing rituals before Egyptian gods. This was not mere flattery, it was a political strategy designed to foster loyalty and mitigate resistance. Darius I, one of the most prominent Persian rulers, went so far as to codify Egyptian laws, an act that not only preserved local traditions, but also legitimized his authority as a just and orderly ruler in the eyes of his Egyptian subjects. While the Persians outwardly honored Egyptian beliefs, their rule brought intense economic pressure. The empire imposed high taxes and mandatory tributes, demanding gold, grain, livestock, and other goods to feed the needs of the Persian military machine. Egyptians increasingly bore the burden of funding an empire they had not chosen, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. This discontent occasionally erupted into violent uprisings. One of the most significant was the rebellion of Inaros II during the 460s BCE. With support from Athens, Inaros briefly seized control of parts of the Nile Delta before his movement was crushed by Persian retaliation. The failed revolt highlighted both Egypt's enduring desire for autonomy and the formidable might of the Persian war machine. Egypt finally regained independence in 404 BCE, taking advantage of a moment of instability within the Persian Empire. Native rulers established the 28th, 29th, and 30th dynasties, a short-lived but passionate attempt to restore Egyptian sovereignty. Over the next 60 years, kings like Nectanebo I focused on reviving traditional temple building, promoting artistic revival, and strengthening defensive fortifications in anticipation of future invasions. This was a last effort to erase the memory of foreign domination, reaffirming Egypt's identity through its architecture, religious institutions, and cultural symbols. In 343 BCE, the Achaemenids returned. This time, Artaxerxes III led the charge. Unlike earlier Persian kings who had tried to accommodate Egyptian traditions, Artaxerxes' regime was marked by intolerance and violence. The Second Persian occupation was characterized by widespread looting, the systematic destruction of temples, and the execution of Egyptian leaders accused of supporting resistance movements. The priesthood, once respected by the first Persian conquerors, was now targeted, stripped of power and resources. Persian authorities dismantled defensive structures, imposed crippling fines, and used ruthless repression to prevent another rebellion. The brutality of this period deepened national trauma and widened the divide between occupier and occupied. Persian dominance crumbled just 8 years later. In 332 BCE, Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt as part of his wider conquest of the Achaemenid Empire. Rather than resistance, he was welcomed as a liberator. The Egyptians, weary of Persian oppression, saw in Alexander a potential restorer of order and piety. At the sacred oracle of Siwa in the western desert, the priests declared Alexander a son of Amun, granting him divine legitimacy. This moment transformed him in the eyes of the Egyptian people, not merely a conqueror, but a divinely sanctioned ruler, a title that no Persian king had ever truly earned within Egypt's spiritual framework. The Persian period in Egypt was one of contradiction, reverence and repression, integration and exploitation. It demonstrated the complexities of foreign rule in a land steeped in tradition. While Persian kings at times honored Egyptian culture, their imperial ambitions often brought suffering. Egypt's struggle during this period was not just about borders or sovereignty. It was about identity, the effort to remain Egyptian under foreign control. The eventual arrival of Alexander the Great marked the end of Persian domination, but it also ushered in a new era of Hellenistic influence, forever altering the path of Egyptian civilization. The declaration by Egyptian priests that Alexander the Great was the divine son of Amun marked more than a religious endorsement. It symbolized the beginning of a profound transformation across the Egyptian landscape. What follows when a legendary military commander, already known for toppling empires, sets out not just to conquer, but to reshape an ancient civilization in his image? The answer: a bold new city, Alexandria, that would rise to become the cultural and intellectual heart of the ancient Mediterranean. In 331 BCE, shortly after his ceremonial enthronement as pharaoh in Memphis, Alexander initiated a project that would redefine Egypt's role in the ancient world. He selected a prime site for a new city, nestled between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, a region blessed with a deep natural harbor, fertile hinterlands, and defensible terrain. This location was not chosen by accident. It represented both strategic foresight and imperial ambition. To realize his dream, Alexander enlisted Dionysius of Rhodes, a celebrated urban planner, to design the city. Following the Hippodamian grid plan, Alexandria featured wide, straight avenues intersecting at right angles and distinct residential zones organized by ethnicity, including quarters for Greeks, Egyptians, and Jews. This deliberate division was not just practical, it was symbolic of Alexander's ideal of cultural integration, a principle historians now refer to as homonoia, unity through shared respect and fusion. As he assumed his dual role, Greek conqueror and Egyptian monarch, Alexander demonstrated political brilliance by blending the administrative strengths of both Macedon and Egypt. Rather than displacing the native bureaucracy, he chose to incorporate it into his new regime. He appointed Cleomenes of Naucratis, a trusted Greek official, to oversee financial matters, yet retained many local Egyptian administrators in their regional posts. This thoughtful fusion prevented the kind of bureaucratic alienation that had plagued Persian rule. It also won the loyalty of both elites and the common people. Alexander's governance model was pragmatic but deeply aware of cultural sensitivities. He knew effective leadership in Egypt required more than dominance, it required respect. Where earlier conquerors had often alienated native populations, Alexander took a radically different path. He fully participated in Egyptian religious rites, offering tributes at temples and embracing his role as pharaoh. In visual depictions and official inscriptions within Egypt, he appeared wearing the Nemes headdress, holding the crook and flail, symbols of divine kingship. At the same time, he maintained his Macedonian identity when leading his army and communicating with Greek subjects. This subtle form of cultural dualism allowed him to command respect from multiple audiences and build a uniquely flexible imperial identity. Alexander was not merely tolerated in Egypt, he was embraced. In spring 331 BCE, after laying down the foundations of Alexandria and securing Egypt under his rule, Alexander departed to pursue his campaign against the Persian Empire. He would never return. Over the next 8 years, his conquests would stretch from the Nile Valley to the Indus River, forming one of the largest empires in ancient history. In 323 BCE, while in Babylon, Alexander died suddenly, likely from fever or illness, triggering an immediate crisis over the future of his empire. With no clear successor, his top generals, known as the Diadochi successors, began to vie for control over the various territories he had conquered. The struggle over Egypt was especially fierce. One of Alexander's closest companions, Ptolemy, a childhood friend and general, made a daring move that would alter history. He intercepted Alexander's funeral procession, which was intended for burial in Macedonia, and rerouted it to Memphis, eventually transferring the body to Alexandria. This strategic act was more than personal devotion, it was a political masterstroke. By claiming the physical remains of Alexander, Ptolemy also claimed spiritual and symbolic authority over Egypt. In 305 BCE, he officially declared himself Ptolemy Isoter Savior, establishing the Ptolemaic dynasty, which would endure for nearly 300 years. Under the Ptolemies, Alexandria evolved into a glittering capital of Hellenistic civilization, fusing Greek, Egyptian, and Middle Eastern influences. Its two greatest landmarks, the Pharaohs Lighthouse, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and the Library of Alexandria, defined its global reputation. The library, conceived as a repository of all human knowledge, may have housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, attracting scholars from across the known world. The adjacent Museion, a temple of the Muses, functioned as the first research institute in history. This era saw intellectual titans like Euclid, the father of geometry, Archimedes, the engineering genius, and Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable precision. Though Alexander's time in Egypt was brief, his influence reshaped it for centuries. His founding of Alexandria laid the groundwork for a new era of scholarship, culture, and imperial administration, where the legacies of Greek rationalism and Egyptian tradition could thrive side by side. Through his calculated reverence and pragmatic governance, Alexander the Great did not merely conquer Egypt, he redefined it. As Rome's influence swept across the ancient world like an unstoppable tide, Egypt stood on the edge of a precipice. It would not be brute force or spectacle that shaped its final stand, but the strategic brilliance of a queen unlike any before her. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, did not rely on military might alone. She wielded sharp intellect, political mastery, and a charismatic presence that nearly preserved her nation's independence against Rome's looming power. Born in 69 BCE, Cleopatra emerged from a royal lineage, the Ptolemaic dynasty, rife with internal betrayal, conspiracies, and bloodshed. Yet, unlike many of her ancestors who ruled from isolation and decadence, Cleopatra was shaped by a rigorous education. She studied Greek philosophy, rhetoric, astronomy, and mathematics, all under the tutelage of Alexandria's finest scholars. But her greatest gift was linguistic. Cleopatra reportedly spoke 9 languages fluently, including Egyptian, an extraordinary achievement considering that none of her Ptolemaic predecessors had bothered to learn the native tongue of their subjects in over 300 years of rule. This single act earned her unmatched respect among the Egyptian populace. Her ascent to power was anything but smooth. Upon the death of her father, Ptolemy Xerxes, in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was required to share the throne with her much younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, per custom. The co-regency quickly devolved into hostility, culminating in Cleopatra being exiled from Alexandria. Her return to the capital came through one of the most iconic moments in ancient political theater. As Julius Caesar pursued his rival Pompey the Great into Egypt, Cleopatra arranged to meet him in secret, famously smuggling herself into his quarters wrapped in a carpet or possibly a linen sack, according to some sources. This daring move captured Caesar's attention and ultimately his support. With Roman military backing, Cleopatra was reinstated as queen, and their alliance grew deeper. Caesar fathered a child with her, Ptolemy XV Philopator Philometor Caesar, later known as Caesarion. But their relationship was more than personal. It was a strategic exchange of mutual benefit. Cleopatra secured her throne, and Caesar gained privileged access to Egypt's grain reserves and resources. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra's political calculus shifted again. She quickly aligned herself with Mark Antony, one of Rome's most powerful military leaders and a central figure in the Second Triumvirate, the three-man rule that governed Rome during its turbulent transition from republic to empire. Their alliance was sealed not only by political necessity, but also by passion. In 41 BCE, Cleopatra hosted Antony in Alexandria, where she impressed him with lavish feasts and extravagant displays of wealth and culture. Their union produced 3 children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene II, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, and brought Egypt territorial rewards, including Cyprus, parts of Cilicia, Phoenicia, and Colsyria. These territorial expansions reinforced Egypt's autonomy, but provoked alarm in Rome, especially from Gaius Octavius Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted heir and Antony's political rival. Octavian, determined to undermine Antony and Cleopatra, launched a highly effective propaganda campaign. He depicted Antony as a Roman general seduced and corrupted by a decadent foreign queen, a woman painted as the embodiment of Eastern sensuality and manipulation. Cleopatra, in this portrayal, was no longer a sovereign ruler, but a siren leading Rome's champion astray. This depiction would persist for centuries, coloring Western interpretations of Cleopatra's life. But archaeological findings tell a different story. Surviving coins minted in her reign show a woman with sharp, strong features, a prominent nose, and piercing expression, far from the stylized beauties of Roman frescoes or Hollywood films. In 32 BCE, Octavian successfully persuaded the Roman Senate to declare war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra herself. This move cleverly framed the conflict as a war to protect Rome from foreign influence. The decisive encounter came a year later, in 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium off the western coast of Greece. Octavian's admiral, Marcus Agrippa, commanded a superior naval force that decisively defeated the combined fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Though they escaped with their lives, their strategic position was destroyed. Back in Alexandria, with Octavian's army drawing ever closer, Antony was misled into believing Cleopatra had died. In despair, he took his own life, falling on his sword. Cleopatra, realizing that she would be humiliated in a Roman triumph, paraded through the streets of Rome in chains, chose her own fate. According to Roman historians, Cleopatra arranged for a venomous asp, possibly an Egyptian cobra, to be delivered concealed in a basket of figures. She and her two handmaidens allowed the snake to bite them, ending their lives in controlled defiance. However, modern historians continue to debate this account, suggesting that she may have used a fast-acting poison or a combination of toxins instead. What remains certain is that Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, died in 30 BCE, marking the definitive end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and Egypt's independence. Egypt became a Roman province, ruled directly from Rome, and Octavian would go on to become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Though Rome claimed her land, Cleopatra's legacy survived in myth, scholarship, and legend. She remains one of history's most enigmatic rulers, an icon of power, intelligence, and resilience. Neither Rome's propaganda nor centuries of male-dominated historiography could fully erase her achievements or reduce her to a mere seductress. Her story endures not because she ruled with brute force, but because she commanded with strategy, diplomacy, and unshakable resolve, a queen whose brilliance outshone the fading light of an empire. The snakebite that supposedly ended Cleopatra's life was more than the tragic demise of a queen. It symbolized the end of Egypt's independence, concluding a nearly 3,000-year era of sovereign civilization. With Cleopatra's death and Egypt's fall in 30 BCE, Rome did not merely claim a new territory. It consumed an entire identity. The land of the Pharaohs, once a beacon of power and culture, became an imperial asset under the direct control of Augustus, the man who would become Rome's first emperor. When Augustus returned triumphantly to Rome in 29 BC, he brought with him not only Egypt's immense wealth, its grain, gold, and trade networks, but also its political fate. Unlike most Roman conquests, which were administered under senatorial oversight, Egypt was treated differently. Augustus made Egypt his personal property, too essential to entrust to any senator or provincial governor. In fact, Roman senators were prohibited from entering Egypt without explicit authorization from the emperor himself. Instead, Augustus appointed a prefect from the equestrian class, a rank just below the senatorial elite, to govern in his name. This position wielded powers akin to those of the emperor. highlighting Egypt's exceptional status within the empire. The inaugural prefect, Cornelius Gallus, wasted no time consolidating control. He installed a Roman garrison in Alexandria, quelled remaining Ptolemaic resistance, and used hieroglyphic inscriptions to celebrate his victory, ironically adopting the very script and symbols of the ancient culture he subdued. Roman dominion was stamped not just in military presence, but etched in stone with the language of the vanquished. Egypt's fertile soil, particularly in the Nile Delta and Fayum region, was of paramount importance to Rome. The province became the breadbasket of the empire, supplying an estimated one-third of the grain consumed by the population of Rome itself. Massive grain ships, specially constructed to handle heavy loads, transported over 150,000 tons annually up the Tiber River. So vital was this supply that Augustus created a dedicated military unit to safeguard the grain routes. Later emperors recognized the same truth. Control over Egypt meant control over Rome's food supply. When Vespasian vied for power during the Civil War of 69 CE, his first strategic move was to secure Egypt, understanding that starvation could bend Rome to his will. Roman expertise in hydraulic engineering reshaped Egypt's agricultural landscape. They expanded canals, improved irrigation systems, and introduced new farming techniques that pushed agricultural productivity beyond even Ptolemaic levels. The Fayum Basin, already fertile under previous rulers, was further enhanced as the Romans converted marginal lands into lush, cultivated fields. But this prosperity came at a human cost. Egyptian peasants faced crushing taxation, sometimes so severe that entire villages were abandoned to escape the burden of imperial levies. Rome's hunger was fed by the backbreaking labor of Egypt's rural population. In a fascinating paradox, Roman emperors adopted pharaonic iconography while systematically stripping Egypt of its sovereignty. Temple walls at Dendera, Edfu, and Philae depict emperors in traditional Egyptian poses, offering to the gods, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and encased in cartouches typically reserved for native kings. At Kamambo, Emperor Tiberius is depicted in rigid ceremonial posture, 1 foot forward, arms extended, identical to depictions of pharaohs from 2 millennia earlier. Even the Temple of Dendur, now housed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, includes hieroglyphs praising Augustus as the son of Ra and Lord of the Two Lands. These depictions served a dual purpose: maintaining religious continuity for the Egyptian populace while legitimizing Roman rule through visual association with divine kingship. Despite political subjugation, Alexandria continued to shine as a hub of learning, commerce, and cultural fusion. Greek philosophers exchanged ideas with Jewish theologians, and Egyptian priests maintained ancient rituals, though increasingly confined to temple walls, as their language and traditions receded from public life. The Library of Alexandria, although damaged during Caesar's siege decades earlier, remained an important intellectual center. It never fully regained its legendary status, but it still attracted scholars, poets, and scientists from across the empire. The city became one of the most cosmopolitan centers in the ancient world, home to Romans, Greeks, Jews, Nubians, and native Egyptians, all coexisting in a dense, urban melting pot unlike any other in antiquity. Religion, too, was undergoing transformation. Initially, the Roman emperors continued the tradition of temple building, especially under rulers like Caligula and Nero. But the slow rise of Christianity began to erode traditional Egyptian religious practices. By the late 4th century CE, Emperor Theodosius I officially banned all forms of pagan worship, dealing a final blow to the ancient faith. Most temples were abandoned or repurposed. Yet some, like the Temple of Isis at Philae, continued functioning well into the Byzantine period, only closing in 537 CE when Emperor Justinian issued orders to extinguish the last flicker of pharaonic ritual. Under Roman control, Egypt saw a rise in bureaucratic efficiency. Standardized systems of weights, measures, and currency streamlined commerce and taxation. The province was subdivided into nearly 40 administrative regions, each carefully monitored through censuses, land surveys, and tax records. But this organization masked a deeper exploitation. Rome viewed Egypt not as a culture to be preserved, but as a resource to be extracted. Religious art and monumental inscriptions were preserved only when they served the purposes of imperial propaganda. Beyond this, cultural preservation was minimal. Yet through it all, Egypt remained remarkably resilient. Across invasions, occupations, and dynastic shifts, it adapted and endured. Its ancient identity, though reshaped by foreign hands, continued to influence art, religion, science, and architecture across the Mediterranean world. While Rome ruled over Egypt for centuries, it never truly extinguished the memory or mystique of its ancient civilization. The Nile continued to flow. The temples, though silenced, stood as stone witnesses to a legacy too profound to vanish. Through centuries of conquest, Egypt absorbed new rulers, technologies, and cultures, yet never lost its unique identity. Its strength was not in resisting change, but in adapting to it, all while keeping its ancient soul alive. This resilience ensured that even after empire and pharaohs faded, Egypt's legacy endured.